The door did not give way all at once. Wood cracked first, dry, sharp, final, followed by the sound of boots rushing into a room already too quiet. The men who entered were trained to expect resistance. Raised voices. Flight. Excuses. They were prepared for chaos. They were not prepared for stillness. Margaret Garner stood where the light from the doorway fell across the floor, her hands lowered, her body unmoving. Blood spread slowly beneath her feet, soaking into the grain of the wood as if the house itself were trying to absorb what had just happened. A child lay nearby, not hidden, not shielded, simply there. No one spoke at first. In moments like this, history prefers noise. It prefers screams, frantic motion, obvious villainy. Silence complicates things. Silence demands interpretation. And interpretation is dangerous. What followed would later be reduced to a sentence. Sometimes less. Sometimes a headline trimmed until it could fit beside advertisements and weather reports. Words were chosen carefully, neutral words, gentle words, words that redirected attention away from the room and towards something safer. They would call it a tragedy. They would call it a crime of passion. They would call it madness. What they would not call it was predictable. No official record would begin where this story actually starts. That moment, when the system finally caught up to its own consequences, was treated as an ending. Closed, filed, explained away. But it was not an ending. It was a collision. The kind institutions work very hard to prevent from being seen. The men in the room understood immediately that something had gone wrong. Not just here, but beyond it. Procedures faltered. Authority hesitated. No one rushed forward to assert control. For a brief moment, the machinery stalled. History rarely admits when that happens. Later accounts would rearrange the sequence. They would suggest confusion, emotional instability, a sudden break, anything to imply unpredictability. Unpredictable acts can be dismissed. Systemic ones cannot. So the details began to change. Some records would claim she resisted, others that she wept, some that she collapsed. None could agree. None could explain the calm. Calm implies decision. Decision implies logic. Logic implies responsibility, and not just hers. That is where the discomfort begins. Because if this moment made sense, even briefly, then the fault could not remain isolated to one woman in one room. It would spread outward into policies, contracts, laws written far away by people who would never stand on these floorboards. So the language was softened. Violence became incident. Blood became evidence. A child became subject. And Margaret Garner became something easier to manage than a thinking human being. The story was rerouted before it ever reached the public. You were never meant to sit with this moment. You were meant to skip past it. To accept the version where events erupt without warning. Where systems remain neutral observers. Where responsibility begins and ends with the person holding the knife. But nothing about that room suggests surprise. The stillness matters. The way she did not run matters. The way the system arrived only after everything irreversible had already occurred matters. Because this was not a failure of enforcement. It was not a lapse in order. It was the outcome of order functioning exactly as designed. History avoids moments like this because they strip away the comfort of distance. They force proximity. They place consequences where intentions once hid. This is why accounts disagree. Not because witnesses were unreliable, but because the truth was structurally inconvenient. To tell this story honestly would require asking why no intervention came sooner. Why escape felt impossible. Why death could appear, to one person in that room, as the only remaining form of control. Those questions threaten foundations. So the records begin later than they should. They begin with law enforcement, with charges, with debates, with process. They do not begin with pressure. They do not begin with narrowing choices. They do not begin with inevitability. But that inevitability was already present when the door broke open. It lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable, even as officials stepped carefully around it. And it lingered long after the room was cleared, the body removed, the floor scrubbed. What happened here did not end with Margaret Garner. It exposed something the system could not afford to examine too closely. Which is why, if this moment feels unresolved, if it feels incomplete, that is not an accident. That is the first act of erasure. And before you can understand what she did, you have to understand what history refuses to say out loud. They called it a domestic disturbance. That phrase appeared first because it was useful. It reduced the scope immediately. It suggested disorder contained within a household, a private failure, a personal collapse. It implied that whatever had gone wrong belonged to the woman inside the room, not to the structures outside it. They called it an unfortunate incident when the story traveled further. They called it a case of maternal insanity when they needed sympathy without accountability. They called it murder only when it served procedural necessity, and even then, reluctantly. What they refused to call it was inevitable. The newspapers did not describe the scene as it was found. They avoided specifics. They softened verbs. They shifted attention away from cause and toward spectacle. Readers were invited to judge the act, not examine the conditions. Editors understood their role. They refused to print the whispers that had preceded the event. They refused to print the financial pressures that had tightened months earlier. They refused to print the legal mechanisms that had made escape illegal and separation routine. Instead, they printed commentary, speculation about her mental state, questions about her temperament, carefully placed doubt. This was not ignorance. It was alignment. Institutions do not survive by telling the whole truth. They survive by selecting which truths are safe to acknowledge and which must remain unspoken. The court records followed the same pattern. Testimonies were recorded, then trimmed. Statements that described fear were summarized. Descriptions of pursuit were reframed as misunderstanding. Words that pointed upward, toward law, toward ownership, toward policy, were replaced with words that pointed inward. Emotion, instability, excess, anything that located the problem inside her body rather than around it. The structure of the transcripts tells its own story. Questions were allowed only if they did not threaten precedent. Lines of inquiry that approached systemic responsibility were redirected, delayed, or struck entirely. Judges spoke carefully, lawyers more so. Everyone in the room understood the boundary, even if it was never announced. This case could not become a referendum on the system itself. So the narrative was managed. The event was isolated. The context removed. The implications buried beneath legal formality. Public debate was encouraged, but only within limits. People argued about morality, sanity, and motherhood. They did not argue about ownership. They did not argue about coercion. They did not argue about laws that transformed people into assets. That silence was not accidental. By the time the story reached wider audiences, it had already been reshaped into something familiar, something that fit pre-existing categories, something that could be judged without discomfort. A woman who had gone too far, a tragedy without authorship, a horror without a system behind it. History prefers villains it can recognize. It does not prefer mirrors. The effect of this reframing was immediate and lasting. Once the public accepted the language, the deeper questions became inappropriate. Anyone who tried to ask them sounded radical, emotional, unreasonable. Why would a mother do this? That question was allowed. Why would the law make this possible? That question was not. The story was declared complete long before it was understood. And in declaring it complete, institutions protected themselves. They preserved legitimacy. They ensured continuity. The lie was not that something terrible had happened. The lie was that it had happened in isolation. You were never meant to see the pattern. You were meant to see an exception. That is how the system survives moments like this, not by denying them outright, but by shrinking them until they no longer threaten the whole. The records tell you what they want you to judge. They do not tell you what they want you to forget. And what they wanted forgotten was not Margaret Garner. It was the logic that made her choice legible. Before her name appeared in court documents, before it was spoken with caution or discomfort, Margaret Garner lived a life designed to leave as little trace as possible. She was born into routine, not legacy. No one recorded the day. No official noticed the arrival. Her existence began quietly, as most did in places where people were counted only when they could be used. The world she entered was already structured. Rules were in place long before she learned to speak. They did not need her consent. Her earliest memories were not events, but patterns. Morning came with sound before light, movement before hunger, instructions delivered without explanation. She learned when to be present and when to disappear. Silence was not enforced through punishment alone. It was modeled. Everyone around her practiced it. The environment taught restraint. Living spaces were crowded but emotionally sparse. Possessions were minimal. Nothing was truly owned. Objects passed from hand to hand without permanence, the way people did. Privacy did not exist as a concept. Bodies were visible, accessible, managed. Loss was constant but unremarked. People vanished without warning. Sometimes sold, sometimes reassigned, sometimes simply absent the next morning. Children learn not to ask. Adults learn not to react. Grief, if it occurred, happened privately and briefly. Margaret absorbed this without ceremony. She learned to read faces instead of books, learned to listen for tone instead of words, learned that compliance did not guarantee safety, but resistance guaranteed attention. Her mother did not explain the world. Explanation implied alternatives. There were none to offer. What passed for family life was fragile. Bonds existed, but they were provisional. Everyone understood that closeness carried risk. Attachment made separation sharper. Still, people attached anyway. Quietly, carefully. Margaret grew into her labor early. Her body was assessed, not admired. Strength was noted. Endurance tracked. Utility determined value. Nothing about her was exceptional in the way history prefers. There were no dramatic rebellions. No recorded defiance. She did what survival required. She learned to fold herself into the system's expectations, to move efficiently, to avoid drawing attention, to endure what could not be refused. When she became a mother, there was no celebration. Birth was not a miracle, it was an increase. Another body, another future calculation. She understood immediately what that meant. Children were not protected by innocence. They were evaluated by potential. Growth was observed. Temperament noted. Ownership anticipated. Margaret did not speak to her children about danger. Words were unnecessary. She showed them instead, through caution, through proximity, through silence when footsteps approached. Her life did not contain the language of rights or freedom. Those concepts existed elsewhere, in places she could not reach. Her world operated on different terms. Obedience was expected. Stability was temporary. Safety was conditional. This is how the system shaped her, not through singular cruelty, but through consistency, through repetition, through a lifetime of small instructions that narrowed what could be imagined. By the time pressure began to mount, she was already fluent in constraint, which is why, when the system began to close in, she recognized it immediately. The tightening did not announce itself. It arrived disguised as routine, an adjustment here, a visit there, small enough to dismiss if you wanted to believe nothing had changed. Systems prefer gradual pressure. It prevents panic. It preserves order. Margaret noticed the shift before anyone spoke of it openly. There were more conversations held out of earshot. Men who had once passed through without comment now paused, measuring rooms, counting bodies. Paper appeared where memory had been sufficient before, lists folded into coats, ledgers brought closer to the house. Economics moved first. Prices changed in distant markets, but their consequences traveled quickly. When profits narrowed, calculations sharpened. What had once been tolerated became inefficient. Families were no longer arrangements. They were clusters of assets awaiting optimization. Law followed economics, as it always does. The statutes were already written. They did not need revision, only enforcement. Ownership was clear, movement regulated, resistance criminalized in advance. The law did not threaten. It simply waited, confident that compliance would come eventually. Surveillance increased without fanfare. Paths were watched, deliveries tracked, dogs fed better and stationed closer. Even the river, once a boundary that suggested possibility, was discussed differently now. Ice thickness, patrol schedules, consequences. Margaret heard rumors before she heard decisions. A name spoken, then reconsidered. A child mentioned, then assessed. A pause that lasted a second too long. She understood what pauses meant. They meant someone had been counted. Orders traveled downward in softened language. No one said sail unless necessary. They said transfer, relocation, reassignment. Words designed to reduce reaction. But reactions happened anyway. Women exchanged glances. Men avoided eye contact. Children were kept closer, not out of affection, but strategy. Time began to feel measurable, not in days, but in opportunities closing. Each delay reduced options. Each night that passed made intervention more likely, escape more difficult. The system's power lay in its patience. It did not need to rush. It knew that most people would wait until waiting became dangerous. Margaret felt the narrowing in her body before she articulated it in thought. Sleep shortened. Listening sharpened. The future stopped extending forward and began compressing inward. Planning shifted from long-term endurance to immediate preservation. She watched her children differently now, not as extensions of herself, but as individuals marked by the system for separate futures. She saw how others looked at them, not with cruelty, but with inventory logic. Height, strength, age. The law rendered these observations neutral. There was nothing illegal about looking, nothing violent about deciding. Violence came later, wearing legitimacy. Margaret knew there would be no warning when the decision became final. That was not how it worked. One day someone would arrive with authority already secured. Resistance would be recorded as disruption. Compliance would be recorded as cooperation. Either way, separation would occur. Whispers confirmed what procedure would not. Someone mentioned a date without specifying it. Someone else mentioned transport. A third person stopped speaking mid-sentence and changed subject. The system communicates certainty without clarity. It ensures that those affected know what is coming, but never enough to challenge it formally. Margaret understood the signal. This was no longer a possibility. It was a process already in motion. The river froze further. Patrols adjusted. The space between surveillance narrowed. What had once felt like risk now felt like delay. Waiting had become an action with consequences. The system did not threaten her directly. It did not need to. It had surrounded her with inevitability. Every law, every economic pressure, every quiet assessment converged on the same outcome. The only uncertainty left was sequence. And sequence, she knew, could be fatal. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It assembled itself piece by piece, the way conclusions do when they can no longer be avoided. Margaret did not sit down to decide. She did not weigh options in the abstract. She simply followed each possible path to its end and observed where it led. None of them led away from loss. She had lived long enough under the system to understand how it framed choice. Freedom was not the absence of constraint. It was the illusion created when all outcomes had already been decided. What remained was selection, not escape. Running was the first idea everyone reached for. It always was. But she understood what running actually meant. It meant distance without safety. It meant exhaustion without sanctuary. It meant being pursued not as a family, but as fugitive property. If they were caught, the punishment would be swift and instructional. The children would be separated immediately. Delay would be treated as defiance. Waiting was the second option, though no one called it that. Waiting meant compliance. It meant allowing the system to complete its work without interference. It meant trusting that someone else might intervene or that circumstances might soften. Margaret had never seen that happen. Waiting did not preserve families. It organized their dismantling. There was no legal argument she could make that would matter. The law was already resolved. There was no appeal process designed for her circumstances. There was only enforcement. The system had taught her how to think clearly in moments like this. Emotion was dangerous. It clouded sequence. It delayed action. She did not allow herself that indulgence. Instead, she assessed. If the children were taken, their futures would not be shared. They would be assigned separately, shaped by different hands, different expectations, different forms of discipline. They would learn quickly that memory was a liability. They would survive, but not together. If she resisted openly, the outcome would be the same, only faster and with less dignity. If she did nothing, the outcome would be identical, just quieter. There was no scenario where the system failed to assert ownership. This was the clarity she reached, not despair, not panic, but recognition. The system had removed all safe outcomes. What remained were only endpoints. Margaret understood that the only variable left was control. Not control over the future that had been taken, but control over the manner of ending. Over sequence. Over who decided what happened first. This is where history often inserts emotion it cannot document. It imagines rage. It imagines hysteria. It imagines a sudden break. But nothing in Margaret's life suggested impulsivity. Her existence had been shaped by consequence. Every action she had ever taken had been calibrated for survival. This decision followed the same logic. She did not think in terms of morality. The system had already defined morality against her. She thought in terms of outcomes. Which outcomes were negotiable? Which were not? She understood that some endings could not be reversed once set in motion. That mattered. The system relied on reversibility, on the idea that people could be moved, sold, corrected, repurposed. An irreversible act disrupted that logic. Margaret did not articulate this to anyone. She did not need to. She had learned long ago that explanation invited interference. Silence preserved agency. She observed the space around her carefully. The timing, the proximity of authority, the absence of witnesses who would intervene too early. Her calm was not denial. It was preparation. She did not rush because rushing would introduce error. She did not delay because delay would invite interruption. She moved within a narrowing window she could feel closing. This was not a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between who would decide the ending. The system had assumed that decision belonged to it. Margaret understood, with unsettling precision, that this was the last moment that assumption could be challenged. And once she reached that understanding, the question was no longer whether something irreversible would occur. It was who would author it. There was no announcement, no declaration, no signal that something irreversible was about to occur. The room remained ordinary in every visible way. Objects stayed where they were. Light entered through the same opening it always had. Nothing in the environment reacted in advance. Margaret moved with precision. Her actions were not hurried, but they were efficient. She did not pause to reconsider because reconsideration had already happened. The sequence was settled before she began. What remained was execution. Silence dominated the space. That silence is often misunderstood. It is described later as shock, or emptiness, or emotional collapse. In reality, it was focus, the kind that excludes everything unnecessary, the kind shaped by years of operating under constraint. There were no raised voices. The system expects noise when control is challenged. Noise invites intervention. Noise allows authority to reassert itself. Margaret did not provide that opening. The act itself did not unfold as a struggle. There was no chaos to document, no extended motion, no spectacle. Cause and consequence followed each other without interruption. This matters, because when historians attempt to explain what happened, they look for signs of instability, evidence that something broke unexpectedly. They do not find it, so they insert it later, retroactively, because the alternative is worse. The alternative is intention. Margaret did not act against time. She acted within it. She understood that authority was approaching. That paperwork had already been prepared somewhere else. That the law was in motion, even if it had not yet arrived at the door. This was not defiance meant to be witnessed. It was prevention meant to be final. When it was over, she did not flee. Flight would have suggested fear. It would have returned control to the system by allowing pursuit, capture, and reclassification. Margaret did not offer that. She remained where she was. Stillness followed action, not as remorse, but as completion. There was nothing left to decide, nothing left to negotiate. The sequence had reached its end. This is the moment history avoids lingering on. Records shorten here. Language becomes abstract. The act is referenced without detail, then quickly passed over. Attention shifts immediately to response, law enforcement, arrest, procedure. That shift is deliberate. To remain with the act itself would require confronting its logic. And that logic does not fit comfortably inside existing frameworks. Margaret did not wait for forgiveness. She did not request understanding. She did not attempt to justify herself in advance. She waited because waiting was now neutral. When the door finally gave way, authority entered a space where authority had already been rendered irrelevant to the outcome that mattered most. The system arrived on time only to document what it could no longer alter. That is why the room unsettled those who entered it. Not because of violence, but because of order. Everything was exactly where it should not have been. The system depends on reversibility, on the ability to move people from one category to another, from one location to another, from one status to another. What Margaret had done resisted that mechanism entirely. There would be no transfer, no reassignment, no future transaction. The outcome was fixed. This is why the act cannot be explained comfortably by the law. The law is designed to respond to disruptions it can still manage. It punishes, corrects, contains. Here, containment arrived too late. So history reframed the act as irrational, as emotional excess, as a moment outside reason. That framing protects the system from a far more dangerous conclusion, that under certain conditions, the most controlled act available to an individual is one that removes the system's options altogether. Margaret's stillness after the act was not surrender. It was acknowledgement. She had done what she set out to do. There was no next step she could influence. From that point on, everything would be managed by others. Forms would be filled out, statements recorded, authority reasserted. The system would recover its balance, but it would never be able to undo what had already been finalized. And that is the part history cannot absorb. Not the act itself, but the fact that, for one moment, the system was forced to respond rather than command. The courtroom was not prepared for what it had been asked to contain. It was built for disputes between recognized parties, for arguments that assumed shared definitions, for conflicts that could be resolved by selecting one statute over another. This case did not fit those expectations, and everyone present understood that immediately. Margaret Garner was brought into the space as a problem, not a person. The law hesitated over how to name her. That hesitation shaped everything that followed. On paper, she occupied two incompatible positions. She was accused of murder, a crime that required intent, agency, and moral responsibility. At the same time, she was claimed as property, a status that denied all three. The law could not reconcile these positions without dismantling itself, so it avoided reconciliation altogether. Prosecutors spoke carefully. They framed the act as criminal without fully articulating motive. To do so would have required acknowledging pressure, inevitability, and constraint, conditions the law itself had created. Defense arguments circled without landing. They gestured toward humanity, but were constrained by precedent. They could not argue freedom without first admitting it had been denied. Judges listened, but their questions avoided substance. They focused on jurisdiction, procedure, custody. These were safer topics. They did not threaten foundational assumptions. The courtroom became a space of controlled contradiction. If Margaret was fully human, then the system had driven her to an act it could not morally withstand. If she was not fully human, then the charge of murder collapsed under its own logic. The law chose neither conclusion. Instead, it fractured responsibility across institutions. One body claimed authority over punishment. Another asserted ownership. Each deferred to the other when pressed too closely. This diffusion of accountability was not accidental. It was structural. No single entity wanted to be the one to resolve the contradiction, because resolution would have required admission. Admission of harm. Admission of coercion. Admission that the system's outcomes were not accidental deviations, but predictable results. Witnesses testified, but only partially. Their statements were shaped by the questions aloud. When testimony approached uncomfortable territory, it was redirected or cut short. The courtroom listened to descriptions of the act, but not to descriptions of the conditions that preceded it. This imbalance mattered. Violence was examined in isolation, stripped of context, as if it had emerged spontaneously. The system positioned itself as a neutral observer responding to an anomaly, rather than as an architect responding to its own design. Margaret spoke little. This was interpreted as detachment, or guilt, or emotional vacancy. It was none of those things. She understood that the courtroom was not a place where her reasoning would be evaluated fairly. It was a place where her existence would be categorized. Responsibility shifted sideways, passed along institutional lines until no single body could be said to hold it. This diffusion was efficient. One authority claimed precedence, then deferred. Another accepted control, then limited its scope. Each step appeared reasonable on its own. Together, they ensured that no fundamental question had to be answered. The outcome was cold, but orderly. Margaret was removed from the public eye, not executed, not exonerated, simply placed where scrutiny diminished and records thinned. She became a logistical problem rather than a moral one. Children who remained were processed separately, not discussed as a unit, not remembered together. Each was assigned a future disconnected from the others, their shared past treated as irrelevant. Witnesses were released from obligation, their testimonies archived, then forgotten. Some accounts were never recorded at all. Silence, once again, proved easier to manage than contradiction. The courtroom emptied quickly. Officials returned to routine. Reporters moved on. New cases filled the docket. The disruption had been contained. The system resumed its rhythm. Nothing about this ending felt dramatic, and that was its strength. Drama invites scrutiny. Bureaucracy dissolves attention. Margaret's name continued to circulate briefly, but only as reference, as precedent, as footnote. The story lost detail with each retelling, until only the outline remained. A woman, a crime, a decision. Stripped of context, it became manageable. The system did not need to justify itself further. It had reasserted control not through force, but through process, through delay, through reclassification. This is how institutions endure moments that threaten their coherence. They absorb them, dilute them, and move forward unchanged. Margaret Garner did not receive redemption. That concept did not apply. Redemption implies acknowledgement. It implies that something went wrong. The system admitted no such thing. What mattered was continuity, and continuity was preserved. Margaret Garner did not vanish all at once. Erasure is not an event. It is a process. It begins quietly, with omissions small enough to appear accidental. A line missing from a ledger. A date left blank. A note shortened until it no longer explains anything at all. The records that survived did so unevenly. Some documents listed her name without detail. Others referenced her only indirectly. The woman, the subject, the case. In several places, she disappeared entirely, replaced by numbers or procedural shorthand. Transfer completed. Custody resolved. No explanation required. Trial transcripts told the same story through absence. Pages existed where testimony should have been. Statements began mid-thought. Context was removed with precision, leaving behind language that appeared complete but explained nothing. This was not sloppiness. It was maintenance. Institutions are meticulous about what they preserve. They know that memory shapes accountability. So they preserve structure and discard disruption. Graves tell another version of the silence. There is no confirmed marker bearing her name. No documented resting place preserved with care. If she was buried, it was without ceremony. If records existed, they were never centralized. Land changed hands. Boundaries shifted. Memory dissolved into geography. Even the children were absorbed into the system's anonymity. Their identities fragmented across households, records altered to suit new arrangements. Shared history became administratively inconvenient. Together, they ceased to exist. Libraries archived newspapers, but only the versions that had already been softened. Later corrections referenced earlier articles that no longer survived. Citations pointed to sources that could not be found. The trail thinned deliberately. Historians encountered the gaps and labeled them uncertainty, ambiguity, lack of evidence. Few questioned why the evidence was missing in the first place. Absence was treated as coincidence rather than outcome. No institution took responsibility for preserving her full story because no institution benefited from doing so. The system had already absorbed the disruption. There was no incentive to remember the cost. Over time, Margaret Garner became an abstraction, a case study, a debate topic, a reference point stripped of texture. Her interior life disappeared first, then her context. Finally, even her name became optional, replaced by descriptors that allowed distance. This is how silence completes the work violence begins. Not through denial, but through indifference. The system did not need to destroy the story. It only needed to stop caring whether it was told accurately. And once that happened, forgetting became not just possible, but normal. By now, you know what the records refused to say plainly. You know how the story was thinned, edited, categorized, and filed away until it no longer threatened anything. You know how the system learned to speak in neutral tones when describing irreversible harm. You know how silence was not an accident, but a conclusion. And now the burden shifts. Not to judges, not to historians, not to institutions that have already decided what is worth preserving. It shifts to you. Because history does not only exist in archives. It exists in what a society chooses to revisit. And what it decides is too uncomfortable to hold for very long. Margaret Garner is not haunting because of what she did. She is haunting because of what her actions force into view. She forces a question that cannot be filed, categorized, or dismissed as a product of another time. A question that does not stay safely in the past, no matter how much we insist it belongs there. The question is not whether her actions were legal. The law answered that. The question is not whether they were moral. Morality fractures too easily under pressure. The question is simpler and far more dangerous. What does a system have to be before death becomes a rational alternative to life within it? That question is uncomfortable because it removes distance. It collapses the space between then and now. It refuses to let the listener remain neutral. If survival requires the surrender of autonomy, dignity, memory, and future, what exactly is being preserved? And who gets to decide that preservation is enough? Margaret did not write a manifesto. She did not explain herself for history's benefit. She did not ask to be understood. She acted within a world that offered no acceptable outcomes, only varying degrees of violation. And in that world, she chose the outcome she could control. That is the part the system cannot forgive. Not because it was violent, but because it was deliberate. Systems depend on predictability, on compliance disguised as inevitability, on the assumption that people will endure almost anything if the alternative is framed as worse. Margaret shattered that assumption. She demonstrated that there is a threshold beyond which survival loses its meaning, that there are conditions under which existence itself becomes an extension of violence. And if that is true, if she was not an anomaly but a consequence, then the problem was never her. It was the structure that produced her choice. This is why forgetting is useful. Forgetting turns her into an exception instead of evidence. Forgetting allows the system to remain abstract rather than accountable. Forgetting reassures us that such choices belong only to a brutal past, not to any structure that could ever exist again. But forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is a position. When a society forgets stories like Margaret Garner's, it is not choosing peace. It is choosing comfort over clarity. It is choosing not to examine how power behaves when it is insulated from consequence. And that choice has a cost. Because the conditions that made her decision rational did not vanish overnight. They evolved. They learned new language. They adopted new procedures. They found subtler ways to justify themselves. The question Margaret leaves behind is not whether she was right. The question is whether we are willing to recognize the moment when a system crosses the line from flawed to intolerable. Whether we can identify that moment without waiting for blood to force the issue. Whether we are honest about what people are capable of enduring and what they should never be asked to endure at all. So when you hear her name, or when you don't hear it, when it is missing from the narrative, softened into metaphor, or reduced to footnote, ask yourself why. Ask what it protects. Ask who benefits from your distance. Because the most unsettling part of Margaret Garner's story is not that she chose death over slavery. It is that her choice makes sense. And if it makes sense, then the responsibility does not end with remembering her. It begins with recognizing the structures that make such choices imaginable. That is the question history leaves in your hands. And there is no safe answer.